Now, we do have just under 200 people here, so thank you so much for being here. It can be so tempting, I know, to just wait for the recording, but I think nothing beats being on something like this live. So thank you so much, all of you. 199, we're about to hit that 200 mark. So thank you to the 200 of you. There we go, 200 who are here. I'm absolutely delighted to have you here and to know that Simon has such a great, enthusiastic and engaged audience to speak to. Let me explain two things about Simon. One, who he is, and two, why I decided that Simon would be a great keynote speaker for this. So first of all, Simon is a chap that really annoyed me some years ago because he wrote the book I wish I'd written. He wrote a fantastic book, which, let's be honest, Simon, doesn't have the most exciting title, but is an amazing book. It's called Coaching and Mentoring, a Critical Text. It's not the kind of title, is it, that's going to make you want to rush out and queue up at an Apple store for, if they decide to stock it. But it's actually one of the best books ever written on coaching, I think. And the reason why I think it's such a great book is because it comes at least the first part of the book comes at it from the angle of why coaching, why now? Rather like me, Simon is fascinated by ideas and humanity in its broader sense and philosophy. And for anyone who's fascinated by that, you can't help but wonder, what is it about the 21st century, let's say? You could say the end of the 20th century, but what is it about the end of the 20th century and the 21st century that has spawned this thing called coaching? What had to exist mentally, socially, spiritually, in order for coaching to exist? Why wasn't coaching de rigueur in the 16th century? Why wasn't it the thing? I mean, okay, some people argue that Socrates did coaching. If you actually read Socratic texts, if you read Plato, you'll see very quickly it wasn't coaching. But nonetheless, he was probably the closest, to coaching that we've ever had in some ways. But it's kind of curious, isn't it? What had to happen for coaching to emerge as a discipline on the back of multiple other disciplines? And it doesn't exist in isolation. Now, I'm not going to go into that, but when I read Simon's book, I was like, it's so annoying. He wrote the book and is fascinated by the ideas that I was fascinated by. And so I've always wanted to get to know Simon. We've got to know each other over the last couple of years. And so I'm delighted to have him here today. However, what's kind of really, really spurred on Simon being here today is that in some ways he comes at this from an anti-transformational angle. He was interviewed by Yannick for our podcast. And Yannick asks, as a sort of part of the journey of that interview, is what's your take on transformative coaching in one way or another? Broadly speaking, what do you think of transformational coaching? What do you make of it? How do you think it fits into the schema of things and all that kind of stuff? And Simon, I don't know what he did physically because I only heard the podcast, but I imagine him kind of putting his hand on his chin and leaning back and thinking, what does that even mean? And he basically asked the question, what do we even mean by transformation? And to what extent does that concept put pressure on both the client to make a transformational level of change and also put pressure on the relational field to produce something that isn't necessarily the thing that needs to happen? And so I thought, rather than start off being preaching to the choir, so to speak, we would have somebody that challenged us to think differently about this, to really question, what do we mean by transformation? Is it even a thing? And if we're going to call ourselves transformative coaches, or at least align ourselves in some way with that concept of transformation, what do we really say about ourselves? And have we thought it through critically? Have we actually challenged ourselves to say, what does transformation mean to us in a specific way? How does it fit with other forms of coaching or other forms of human change, like psychotherapy or counseling or mentoring or anything else? And I think it's great to have I wouldn't call it a counterpoint. I don't think Simon's presenting a counterpoint, although we'll see over the next 90 minutes, but I think he's presenting a systemic challenge to the notion of what transformation is, such that we can at least critically look at ourselves and say, this is why I think of myself as transformative, or this is why I think of my practice as transformative, or, he's got a really damn good point. I'm going to change something about how I think of this. So that's really why I've got Simon here. I'm excited to kind of see what level of challenge and grit in the otherwise, sorry for shouting at grit, but it's just something to cater to. It's like grit in the otherwise sometimes confluent way of thinking that any given body of coaches can have, whether you're a Gestalt coach or you're a transformative coach or a psychodynamic coach. There can be this confluent way of thinking that we all become aligned to each other. And sometimes you need that piece of grit. In Gestalt, they might call it novelty. Novelty creates change. And I think when we bring a new voice into the space, it enables us to really think afresh about our practice. So I'm not going to bore you with the details of Simon's career in that way that so many bios are read out, just to say that he's the CEO of the analytic network coaching company, and teaches basically a form of, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth here, Simon, but a form of coaching predicated on the work of the psychoanalyst Lacan. I studied with Simon a while back, and it's got a very Lacanian influence, but I don't want to simplify it like that. So, Simon, I'm going to welcome you to the summit. I'm going to make you co-host as well, so you can do all the sorts of stuff you need to do. And welcome, Simon. I'm going to put myself on mute, and I'm going to hand over to you for the next 90 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Animus team, for setting this up, and thank you all for being here. Yes, it's a interesting invite to speak against the topic in hand. So let's start at the beginning. I'm going to introduce myself fully and in some depth as part of my presentation, so I won't do that now. Maybe it's important just to say that I come from a background of thinking from critical theory, interested in social justice issues. I've studied psychoanalysis at much depth. I've taught at the Tavistock Clinic and associate at the Tavistock Institute. I was president of ISPSO, an international psychoanalytic society, applying psychoanalysis to organizations. And I bring also a multiple kind of lens. So I read theology, I read philosophy, I read many diverse ways of thinking to try and keep myself afresh and not stuck in one school of thinking. I also bring a huge depth of experience, and I'll talk more about that. When I was asked in the podcast about transformation, I had a kind of a gut reaction. It was like, transformation has become a fetish, I think. This is my challenge. I hope that my coaching work does lead to some transformation as a byproduct of what I do. But I don't forefront my work with transformation. So today I'm going to explore the possibilities of thinking about transformation differently by removing the trans and thinking about formation. So this is what this morning until 11 o'clock is going to look like. I'm going to start with why transformation coaching is problematic, do a brief introduction to formation, why coaches should focus on formation, and then I'm going to locate myself, because if we're going to coach transformationally or focusing on formation, we have to locate ourselves and understand how we are formed. We can't help our clients go through a formation process unless we have done the work ourselves. So I'm going to share some of my formation process. We'll then have some breakouts, and I'm going to invite you to think about your reactions to that, your associations to that, and to start thinking about locating yourselves. You know, what was your formation about? So you'll be participants in this morning rather than just observers. And then I'm going to talk about a 5-frame coaching system I've been working with for a number of years now, and it really aims to take clients on a formation journey. And then we'll finish with a brief statement on the meaning of coaching, and I'll open it up to plenary discussion, Q&As. I think it's worth saying that engaging 200 people on a Zoom call is a kind of a bit of a task. It's much nicer to be in a room where you can see eyes and faces and reactions. So sat in my home office feels like I'm a bit of a distance from you. So I might just stop and check in that you're still there and with me as we go. So why transformational coaching is problematic? I came across transformational coaching after I came across transformational leadership, and the two are very combined, and I'll show you how that works in a minute. I did a PhD on leadership at Lancaster University, and I dug deep into leadership over the last 100 years. I explored the 4 discourses of leadership. What kind of thoughts around leadership do we have? What unconscious thoughts, what discourses shape our thinking around leadership? And I came up with 4 discourses. One was the controller leadership, which was really about the industrial age, about top-down management, about controlling workers, controlling them, managing them, supervising them, time and motion studies, Ford and Taylorism. We then moved into a phase in the 60s to 80s of therapist leadership, where the shift really focused on, rather than controlling workers, you'd motivate workers. It was all about happy workers are more productive workers. And there's a democratizing principle, and all the soft skills we're very aware of started to be taught in business schools, group work, how groups work together, how teams work together, individual motivations, and things like psychometric testing, and psychologists and personnel departments became big in the workplace. That was followed in the 1980s by what I call Messiah leadership. And Messiah leadership is what I'm going to talk about in a minute. And it was followed then by what I've been calling for the last 10 years, 12 years, eco-leadership. And eco-leadership is really about understanding leadership in ecosystems. But Messiah leadership came directly from this idea of transformation. There was a problem in the West. There was a big economic slump in the 1980s, and in Japan and South Korea, their manufacturing processes started to overtake the USA. It was a big shock to the system. Toyota outperformed Ford. Mitsubishi became big. And they started to think about, why is our management, why is our leadership not enabling us to perform as well as the Asian cultures? And their answer was to try and rethink leadership. And they came up with this idea of transformational leadership. And the idea was that a transformational leader would be a charismatic leader who'd create a vision, and the workers would follow that vision. They'd follow it with their souls. You didn't have to control workers. You didn't have to motivate workers. Workers would follow you because they believed in you. Steve Jobs stood up in his black polo neck in front of thousands of adoring workers, and they believed in Steve Jobs, and they believed in the dream of Apple, and they worked from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. and needed no further motivation. And on the screen you'll see some of the language used in that time. So Keith Grint, a leadership scholar, writes, during the 1980s, charismatic leadership returned with vengeance, complete with all the accoutrements of biblical charismatics, including visions, missions, and zealot-like disciples. Ulrich writes, religious imagery was used to encourage Messiah leaders to take the role of the missionary, converting key personnel to institutionalize new rituals, symbols, language, and heroes. And Collins and Porras, in their very famous book, bestseller Built to Last, claim that, in short, a cult-like tightness around an ideology actually enables a company to turn people loose to experiment, change, adapt, and above all, to act. So you can see that there's this language of visions, of prophecy, of creating cult-like cultures in organizations, and we're being told this is good. And it kind of smacked me in the face, and I thought, no, cults aren't good. You know, you might get they're really not good. And when my work takes me into corporate banks, it takes me into corporate manufacturing companies. I work in Microsoft, in Ford, in these big organizations with their senior leaders, and I get a feeling that this transformational leadership language does produce a very conformist culture, and it worries me. What's that got to do with coaching? Well, if you look at we skip the slide. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Google Ngrams. It's very interesting. You put a word in and it searches millions and millions of books to see how often that word is used, and it produces a graph. So if you put in transformational leadership into the search engine, it produces this graph on the left. And the graph says that transformational leadership was hardly used at all as a word until the 1980s. Then you can see this massive sharp rise, really sharp rise, where it became hugely kind of popular and in every book, and everybody was talking about transformational leadership. And they still are quite a lot. It's still a currency to be used. If you look at the right of the screen, you'll see the words transformational coaching. And transformational coaching follows transformational leadership. You can see a kind of delayed action. You can see it was quiet until the 1990s, and then it started to be used, and then in 2000 it shot up and became very popular. So my hypothesis is that transformational coaching became popular in order to coach transformational leaders, and the two things became entangled and entwined. Now the problem with that is that coaches, thinking themselves as agents of transformation, take on a kind of self-importance. They take on the ideas of transformational leadership, which I've problematized, which I think are challenging, and I don't think are very helpful to organizations. I don't think Messiah leadership, charismatic leaders who lead top down, are very helpful. And coaches who try and engage with transformational leadership are also problematic. And then this slips into life coaching, it slips into everyday coaching. Many of you will be coaching in organizations, and many of you won't be. But the same language is used, and the same language seeps into wider culture. So how can we transform ourselves becomes a key object of desire. A transformational coach has the idea that the client in front of them is an object to transform. The goal is to transform. So what you're going to transform, you're going to transform this object called a client or a coachee. And it sets up this kind of dynamic. It also sets up the idea that the coach is an expert in transformational work. And if you're an expert in transformational work, that's quite a heavy burden to carry. It leaves a big task on your shoulders. You have to, in some ways, be some kind of savior. And for me, it gets in the way of what I call the real work of coaching, which is much more about formation, much more about allowing the client to form themselves. Now, in this address, you'll clearly hear there's a bit of polemic going on here. I know that many of you, when I talk about formation, you'll say, yeah, that's the kind of work I do, and we do some transformational work as well. And there is a blurred boundary. So all I'm trying to do is provoke thinking, not make a case of right and wrong. When I was studying my PhD, I came to the last final write-up, and I was trying to think about a chapter to write on leadership development, what it meant to develop leaders, how we could, and what part coaching played in that was part of this research. And I went to study in Berkeley, California. I went to study theology for a few months in Berkeley, California, and I took a road trip And on that road trip, I travelled along the Big Sur, which is incredibly beautiful, with the big trees and the Pacific Ocean. And I saw a sign which said Hermitage. And I followed that sign, and I saw the gates of the Hermitage were closed. So I put my little tent up and I camped outside. And the next day, the abbot of the Hermitage came out and he invited me in. And I stayed with these monks, Camaldolese monks, a Benedictine group of monks, high in the mountains of the Big Sur, in one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. And I lived in a caravan in their garden for a bit. And I was writing. And I observed the monks. And I joined in their cycle of prayer. And I joined in their cycle of life, which was work, prayer, engagement in the community, and solitary time. And it struck me as I watched the monks go about their business that monks don't get trained to be a monk through monk skills or monk training or monk development. They undergo monastic formation. And monastic formation is a process which is both individual and collective. I'm gonna read from my this book, Leadership: A Critical Text. I'm just going to read a chapter about my experience at this Benedictine Hermitage on Big Sur. I observed how the monks underwent the monastic formation and realised that leaders could learn much from this monastic tradition. The idea of formation challenges our modern idea of learning. The monastic tradition does not emphasise a monk's spiritual vocation being learnt through teaching, training, techniques, or personal development. To undergo formation as a monk is not to undergo a series of separate developmental acts, but it's a holistic experience that arises from living in the community. Each monk is continually formed and also contributes to the formation of the community. Monastic communities have mastered and tailored the ability to contain sustainable contexts in which the lives of monks are formed. And the monastic community is continually formed too. A novitiate monk chooses a monastic community that has a specific charism, a gift, the specific order, the Franciscans or the Benedictines. And they take a vow to follow the monastic rule. It is the setting, the rule and the community overseen by an abbot, and they provide a safe, containing space. This is prerequisite for developmental activity to take place. So the parallel in our work is the containing space we create as coaches. It allows formation to take place. Within this physical and spiritual container, the monks are supported to encourage to form what they call the monk within, to develop your monk within. I was told by the community, Simon, you have a strong monk within. And I could feel it. I think I would have been happy to stay there for a long period. They discern and they develop and they form, and their personal and specific charism, which is their unique gift, is developed. The monk's life is formed through partaking in daily spiritual practices, prayer, work, reading the scriptures, the liturgy, which is the form of the religious service, and it is the whole rather than the parts that form the novitiate monk and the community. They call this the life. Thomas Merton, a famous monk, writes about spiritual direction. Spiritual direction does not consist merely of giving advice. The man who has only advice doesn't really have a director, since a spiritual life does not consist in having and thinking, but in being and doing. A director who only gives ideas has not begun to form the one he directs. So monastic formation gave me a way into thinking about leadership formation, and then it filters through to what the role of a coach is. And I think the role of a coach is to help our clients go through a formation process. If you think about formation as a coach, you become more of a facilitating agent, and formation doesn't happen just in the coaching room. I think sometimes we overprivilege or think that as coaches we are these change agents and it all happens in the coaching room. Where I think that formation happens in all aspects of life, like the monks. It happens through your organizational culture, through your work. It happens through your family. It happens through your engagement with friends. It happens when you walk in the forest. Formation happens when you're asleep. It happens in your conscious and your unconscious. It happens in your dreams. So, coaching provides a containing space to allow the client to work on their formation process. And it enables a coach to take up a different stance. You're not there as an expert in transformation to try and transform a person. You're there to hold open a space to allow formation to take place. And of course, a big part of formation starts with the past. What has formed you up to now? What gives you these ideas? What gives you this identity? What cultures, what families, what experiences have formed you? What challenges are you bringing? What strengths do you have? So, when I'm coaching, one of the first things I do with my clients is try and help them locate themselves. And many of my clients turn up and they might be very successful leaders, they might be, and often they are, and they're seen by the world as being very successful and ticking all the boxes of success. And yet when they come to me as a coach, something happens. And in the book Nick talked about, I talk about the coaching confessional. People spill the beans. They tell me about their troubles. They tell me that they feel dislocated. Not lost. They're not, they're successful, but they don't feel quite at home. They don't feel quite in the right place. So the first piece of work I do with people is to help them locate themselves. And as I said earlier, to locate ourselves, to help our clients locate themselves, we have to locate ourselves. So really start to think about what formed us. And I'm going to take you through a short journey of my formation, and I'm leaving a lot out. Whenever you coach a client, there's always gaps and there's always lack. This is a Lacanian idea, that there's always something left out, and that something left out is important. I'm consciously going to leave some things out, which are like deep personal things. I'm going to frame this more through work. It feels a bit talking to 200 people to share very deep personal things when I haven't really met you seems a bit too much. So I'm going to just take you on a journey through my work, what formed me, and make some links in order for you to kind of then reflect on your own formation. So as you're listening to me, just allow yourself to associate, to free associate to what you're hearing. And see if you have an emotional reaction, see what it triggers in you with regards to your own formation, your own experiences. So I was born in Bristol in England and I went to an all-boys school. I was born in a council estate, and my aspiring parents bought a house when I was about 7, and we moved. But I went to an all-boys comprehensive school, which really wasn't very much about education. It was very much about just get these kids through school. And the careers advice towards the end of school was, would you like to be a car mechanic? Would you like to join the army? Or would you like to work in a local aircraft factory? That was like the three choices on offer. I finished that school with 2 O-levels, which if any of you in the British system knows that's not a great result. I tried to go on to sixth form college to retake O-levels so that I could do a bit more education, and they threw me out. I probably had ADHD, I think would be the diagnosis today, but just like sitting still in class was not my thing. It was kind of difficult, and they kind of threw me out, and it's a big shock. I was kind of 16 and a half years old, and my father said, well, then you've got to work. So I went and found a job, and the job I found was an office boy in a factory, a paper bag making factory, and it was a very harsh environment. It was a wake up. It was like from school to factory was a massive kind of emotional shift. And I noticed in the factory that, the noise, there was women at the end of machines packing bags all day. I can still hear the machines today, and women doing this all day, packing bags for 8 hours a day, non-stop. And the men carrying huge loads of paper and ink, and my job was to run up and down the factory stairs and to tell people to put blue ink instead of yellow ink, and to change the run because we were changing the bag run. We would be making ice lolly bags, and more Red Devil ice lollies were selling than Green Dragon ice lollies, and then we had to change all the paper. And my job was constantly to run up and down the stairs and be the information guy and let people know what changes were happening. But in that environment, it was very harsh. I mean, apprentices got a hard time from experienced workers, and people came to work bringing their bodies to work. It was manual labour. There wasn't any idea about bring your passions to work. What you're passionate about, what do you like. It was about you go to work, you earn money, and then you enjoyed yourself at the pub, at the allotment, with your family, with experiences outside work. So this is the idea of work inside and outside, and you lived outside work, and you just brought your body to work, and it was manual labour in work. So I did that for 12 to 18 months, and I was also playing rugby at the time. I was a good rugby player, and some guy at the rugby club befriended me and said, look, Simon, you can do a lot better. You're really good with people. He watched me kind of work with kids on the rugby field, and he said, you're really good with people. Why don't you become a nurse? And it's a very strange thing to say to a young man, because nurses is a female occupation, and we all kind of knew that. And he said, no, they're looking for male nurses, Simon, and you only need 5 O-levels. So I think I collected 4 by that time, and I did one more evening's class, and I applied for nursing. And at the age of 18, I joined Frenchay Hospital, and became a general nurse. And again, a massive thing. So from 18 to 21, I worked in a general hospital, and a nurse, I think, is the profession which works closest to the body than any other profession. You work with the living body and the dying body. You work with the resilient body and the fragile body. I saw many deaths. I laid people out. I saw brain surgery. I saw legs being amputated. I'd be in the emergency room, and it's pretty traumatic. I mean, there'd be a motorway by us, and then there'd be a big crash. 3 motorcyclists will come in my own age, and one of them would die in front of you. And there was no counselling or coaching or a way of supporting that. They'd see you were very upset, and the matron would say, Nurse Western, go and have a coffee break. And kind of that was it. And then in the evening, you'd sit with your friends in a hospital bar, and you'd kind of have this sort of war zone, this sort of debriefing war zone with each other. And it was sort of lots of gallows humour. But that experience was very powerful. I mean, 2 things I gained from that experience. One was the idea of mortality. It was there in your face. This is a living body, but it can also be a dying body very quickly in a moment. And the other thing was the hospital itself was an institution, and it was like being part of an institution. I was othered being a male nurse, and being othered in an all-female kind of culture was interesting. At one moment you're special, you're the desirable other at one moment, as a young man, rugby player, all these women, and there's some nursing sisters who are kind of a bit abusive with that and treated you badly. And the other time you were kind of othered in a very negative way, and I was like a lifting machine. Nurse Weston, go to Ward 27, there's a heavy patient there. Nurse Weston, can you do all the male shaves, please? I wasn't allowed to work on women's wards. So you become othered, and you experience kind of what it is to be other, and that was an important lesson for me, which has kind of stayed with me. I left the general hospital and I went to York. I left my hometown. I studied psychiatric nursing next. And I was really fortunate because just at that period in history, it was kind of the early 1980s, they had this idea of community care, and they were shutting the asylums. They were closing these big Victorian asylums, and the patients were being moved into community care. But I caught the tail end of the asylum, so I worked in an asylum. I worked in neighbouring hospital, and it was a big Victorian asylum outside the city, and it's where the mad people went. It was like the mad people, the crazy ones. There's a lot of jokes, a lot of kind of language like this. Were in the asylum. The asylum was a massive shock to me. My first ward was patients had been there for 20, 30, 40 years, and they were living in a ward of 70 beds without any curtains, with very little private space for themselves, and it was a massive shock. I loved the work because I loved. I came alive. In general nursing, I was struggling. I just about managed to pass my exams. In psychiatric nursing, I finished top of the class and everything. I was really flying. I was really interested in psychology and psychiatry. Suddenly, I found something which kind of really stimulated me, and I realised that I wasn't this stupid kid they told me about when I was at school. That I actually had a brain, and I was really interested. And I met some very interesting people, and they were saying like, read Irving Goffman's kind of Total Institutions, read this, Simon, read that. And I was really stimulated in that kind of whole environment. And two main learning things from the psychiatric hospital which kind of formed me was this idea of the total institution, what institutions do to us, what organizations do to us, what ideology does to us. And it wasn't just the patients who were institutionalized, it was the staff as well. And I realized you didn't want to spend too long there because you either became part of the system or you kind of left. And some of the staff were very institutionalized in quite a damaging way. And you kind of lose a sense of kind of wider reality. That is your whole life, that total institution. And of course, the other thing I learned was the very thin line between madness and sanity. And also how madness and mental health is socially constructed. So there were women there who had postnatal depression in 1955, and they were still there. It's very, very traumatic, to see that, and to realise that even today, how we think about mental health and mental illness is often very socially constructed. Different ideas around what mental health is and what madness is still kind of shape many people's lives. So I left the psychiatric hospital. I went travelling for a bit, and then I took up a role in a therapeutic community. I did the opposite. I went to a therapeutic community for young people. I spent 4 or 5 years, and I absolutely loved it. It was a place where we really encouraged young people to run the community. That I got promoted, and I was a charge nurse at a very young age there, and I was We did some radical transformations. So we got the hospital to stop sending food to these young emotionally disturbed adolescents, all from Liverpool. They lived with us 5 days a week. They went back to their families at weekends, and during those 5 days they ran their community. They decided what they're going to eat. They decided what they did their shopping, their cooking together. If they didn't cook, they didn't eat. And we did group therapy, drama therapy. We had community meetings, and they learned from each other. It's kind of peer-to-peer learning, getting feedback from their peers, much more powerful than getting feedback from a psychiatrist or an adult. And it was a huge kind of joy to work there, and I saw a huge transformation in these children's lives. Not all of them. Some went back to some very deprived conditions. And, another thing I learned there, after that, I became a family therapist in Liverpool. And during that period, it was the post-industrial age in Liverpool. It was the Thatcher years, mass unemployment, mass problems. I saw deprivation like I've never experienced in my life. And I came from a working class background, but this was like another level. Like, seriously, I'd never seen such real deprivation in people's lives. And you realise a connection between kind of mental health and social status and poverty, and ask questions around economics, so not make assumptions that, that this person has the same opportunities as us. So some young people we work with, they did really great work with us, but then they went back to some very troubling conditions, and that was hugely problematic. And from there, I became a community nurse in Liverpool. I spent 10 years in Liverpool running a CAMS team, child and adolescent mental health team. I studied family therapy. I became a UKCP registered family therapist. And it was a shift from thinking about the individual mind to the relational aspects of life. Like with these young people, you realise that it wasn't just about them. They come to you. I mean, a good example, it was a young man came to us. He was 13 years old. And he was a school refuser, and he'd been given anxiety drugs. He'd been given CBT treatment. He'd been given for his anxiety. He'd had everything thrown at him, and then he came to us. And as family therapists, we encouraged his family to come. They all came except for the father, all his siblings, and his mother and his grandmother. And on session 4 or 5, we realised that this young man wasn't refusing school because of anxiety. He was refusing school because his mother was getting beaten up by his father. So this poor kid had been diagnosed, labelled, treated, as an individual unit because of his anxiety, when actually he was at home protecting his mother. So once we kind of sorted that issue out, and the father left the house, and we had social workers come in and things, he could then return to school. But it's a very good example of, when a client comes to you as a coach, not just to see that coach as a individual without any relations around them, to think about them relationally all the time. It's a huge kind of part of this formation work. We're all formed by our experiences, past and present. So I left my job. I became a single parent. I stayed at home with a baby for 3 years. I was on my own with this beautiful little boy, and that was a massively powerful learning experience as well. Again, being othered, walking into mother and toddler groups as a man, and experiencing social services telling me that I need to go back to work and my own family. So the idea of kind of being accepted as a male single parent was kind of not good at that in those days. So that was another experience. But I absolutely loved that time being a parent at home. I stayed over 3.5 years at the age of sort of 25, 26. So it was a very formative experience, bringing up a baby, being on your own with a baby. His mother would live down the road. We were friends, and we'd she went to work, so we'd share co-parenting. But it was a huge kind of learning and beautiful experience. in Liverpool, in the hospital, when I was working there, I got burnt out, to be honest. 10 years of working with suicidal young people, with anorexics, without proper support, without proper supervision, huge kind of waiting list, huge demand. But it wasn't the client group which kind of burnt me out, it was the system, the institution, the bureaucracy, the pain of trying to do some work you really loved versus the barriers put in your way. And that was really frustrating. So I started to think systemically. I started to think about leadership. Why was leadership in this health system so poor? And I started to do some pioneering work, working with social services, with police, with other agencies around individuals. So it wasn't just a family. I realized that you couldn't just sort of help a young person by working with them and their family. You had to kind of get the school involved. You had to get kind of their social workers involved. You had to get kind of, they had a probation officer. You had to get them involved. And you had to kind of get some holistic way of working with these young people. So I started pioneer work there. And I got very interested in institutions and organizations and why things didn't work. So I went to the Tavistock clinic and I studied a master's degree. I'd done a previous master's degree in counselling and psychotherapy whilst I was becoming a family therapist. So as you can see, I really kind of got into this idea of learning. I was just thriving on learning and ideas. And I went to the Tavistock clinic because they offered a course on psychoanalysis and organisations, psychoanalytic consultancy. And I wanted to study psychoanalysis because it seemed very clear to me that the rational kind of managerial answers we had around how organisations should run were quite well established, and yet they didn't run like that. So there must be some unconscious kind of reasons, some irrational reasons why they weren't running like that. So I studied I did a master's, I finished top of class, and they suggested I did a PhD. I went to Lancaster University. I left the family therapy job, and I started a PhD. They saw that I had a talent. They took me into the business school. I met a professor, Jonathan Gosling, who since we worked for 10 years together doing some very dynamic and entrepreneurial work, innovative work in leadership education. He loved my background in family therapy and psychoanalysis, and we managed to apply that to working with leaders and executives. So I suddenly flipped from working with the poorest economic community, suicidal young people. Suddenly I was flying to San Francisco to work with senior executives in Gap. It was like this amazing kind of like dissonance between what I was doing. But I loved it. I finished my PhD. I ended up writing a book. They made me director of coaching there. I started their coaching programs, postgraduate programs. And then I left and I went on quite a journey from then. I taught at the Tavistock, that master's degree. I became director of the master's degree there for a while, the one I was a student on only a few years before. And then I went off on my own. I was very keen to explore outside institutions. I was tired of institutions. I think the general hospital, the psychiatric hospital, the kind of all that kind of life of the university, I was done, I think. And I did some experiential learning. I did some formation work and realized I would probably be happier leading from the edge, being an outside thinker and coming in rather than trying to lead from the center. So since then, I've set up Analytic Network Coaching. I work across the globe. I work with not-for-profit charities. I work with big organizations. I offer coaching, I offer consultancy, I offer leadership development. I offer what I call eco-leadership, this idea of changing the way we think about leadership. So currently I'm an entrepreneur. I've set up the Eco-Leadership Institute, and it's kind of an ethical, social kind of piece of work I'm doing, using all the things I've learned. If you trace that kind of journey I've been on, that idea of formation, I thought a lot about it, and it seems to me that I started off with the body, the manual work in the factory and the general nursing. I moved into the mind. I got really hooked on kind of psychology and psychiatry when I was in the as a psychiatric nurse. So you go from body to mind, an individual, and then you move into the family therapy, and the therapeutic community, about group work and teams and relationships, and thinking about kind of myself and the other, and how we impact on each other. And then you move from the small group into the large group. I start thinking about organizations, studying about, how do organizations impact on us? How does leadership work? How does power work in organizations? How does culture shape us? So you can see this kind of movement outwards from the inner self, the body, the mind, the individual, the family, the organization. And then a lot of my work now is also psychosocial commentary. So I write about the monarchy, I write about big ideas, I write about kind of the environment as well. So there's this kind of holistic kind of movement from the deep inner self, from the individual, team, family, organization, and then kind of wider social issues. And that's kind of the formation process I've been on, and yeah, just shaped how I think about coaching and how I approach coaching. And it makes those links. I think about the body, I think about the individual in the room, the unique individual in the room. I think about their relations to their families and to their teams. I think about kind of the organizational cultures they're in, the networks they're in. And I think about the wider social influences. So if I'm working with an Asian woman in Singapore, it's going to be different to working with a senior leader in Microsoft in Seattle, a man. We have to kind of let go of some of our assumptions, think about the social influences happening. So I've talked enough. I've talked for a good while. I'm going to stop talking. What I'd like you to do is go into small breakout groups and do two things. We'll maybe do work together for 20 minutes, then we'll come back for a half-hour plenary session. So in groups of maybe 3 or 4, think about, one, your physical and emotional kind of reactions to what you've heard this morning. Just kind of associate. Don't go straight to your minds. Think about your bodies and your emotions, your reactions to kind of what you've heard this morning, and then start making connections to locating yourself. What important bits on your journey have formed you? What formation process have you been going through?
Simon, it's Nick here. Just to let you know, I've set up the rooms. There's 70 rooms, believe it or not. And so whenever you're ready, I'll just open up the rooms, okay?
Yeah, so any questions, now's the time, and then we're going to rooms. Any kind of questions about the process? Or are we good? Is it straightforward? Good, okay. So let's do 15 minutes. 15 minutes in your rooms. Enjoy. Thank you, Nick. So I'm going to open this up just for a plenary discussion. I'm going to show a couple more slides in about 15 minutes. So we've got 15 minutes just to ask questions, to reflect, to associate. You don't need to have any clever questions. Just let's just try to make some sense of what your experience is so far.
Hi.
Gosia.
Oh, hi. Yes. So we have a question we actually discussed in our group that we thought maybe you could shed some light on. So, when you talked about the monk and the life and how important the environment and the community were, because you were kind of learning and evolving through being a part of that community. And the question is, how do we then bring that into our coaching? Because it's obviously coaching is one-on-one pretty much, unless you do team coaching, but it's mostly one-on-one, how to bring that.
Yeah, Gosia, thank you for that. I'm going to show you a slide in 15 minutes around a coaching system which helps with that. But just to say, always thinking about the individual in their social network, in their social context, thinking about their formation process, and not just thinking that coaching is a kind of psychological exchange between two people. The people bring into the room their unconscious and their conscious. They bring into the room their culture. They bring in the social speaks through them. it's present in the room. We bring in our organizations in our minds into the room. So as a coach, it's being present to that, just opening that. But I'll show you a kind of way I work through that process in 15 minutes. Annette, did you have your hand raised?
Hello, Simon. Thank you. It's a very, 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 very interesting and fascinating talk you've given me, because while you were talking, I was kind of thinking about my own journey. I mean, I got into coaching because I wanted to help professional women who've been bullied in the workplace. It is something that happened to me. And, whilst having been on that journey, I found there is so much more, because I think, I talk about, how do they interact with their world, with their families, what's going on, what other supports are they getting while they're going through this traumatic process, and it is very traumatic, and so on. And it just makes me realize how deeply misunderstood bullying still is. It's getting better slowly, but it's still very, very much misunderstood. And there's so much more work that has to be done, especially psychological safety in the workplace. That's one example. And again, there's so much more, the culture and how they feel about being bullied and so on, which means that they think it's their own fault.
Yeah, thank you, Annette.
Yeah.
So when you think about this in terms of formation, the work I do with clients and the work I do for myself is to think about how we become very sensitized to certain things. We become very attached to certain things. So I have a kind of really strong radar on total institutions. I walk into a bank and there's kind of 300 bankers there, all in dark suits, all in an open office, and they're all super bright people, but they're incredibly conformist, and a shudder goes down my spine because I get a flashback to the psychiatric institution. And I've said this to kind of people in banks. It doesn't go down too well, but it's a wake up. It's a wake up call. So I'm very sensitized to that, and that sensitivity can make us a good coach in some areas, or it can make us too attached. We can be always looking for bullying, always looking for total institutions. So it's kind of having that awareness around our coaching, what we're attached to and what we're not attached to. Mm-hmm. Libby, did you have a question?
Yeah, Simon, I guess it's around kind of worldview. I've been reading Jeremy Lent's Web of Meaning, you might have heard of, and researching on systems change from the inside out and the outside in. And I guess, if we're talking paradigms, it's like we're in this wider context, a planetary context. And through my work in the climate movement and with leaders in different areas and individuals, I'm kind of sensing, this, I don't know, is it an end game? What's going on in this wider sense that's affecting the space? And I know the Climate Coaching Alliance, have got, we have an agreement around kind of like naming that, whether it's climate or AI or nukes or, whatever. Things seem to be getting more and more real here in the Anthropocene. And so, looking at indigenous knowledge systems, a more ecological self. So the question is just kind of, would you like to riff a little bit on worldview and that wider context that we're in?
Just to say that it's kind of a huge part of the coaching work and the coach training I do. Like that is, I don't think, the coaching room provides a sanctuary from that world. I think it's part of that world. I think as coaches, we're all part of that world. We're all part of the environment. We're all part of the natural world, the technological world. We're all part of these ecosystems, and we have to understand ourselves and our clients as being part of those ecosystems. So I don't come down with a top down kind of, this is kind of what you should do or what you shouldn't do, but I take that perspective, I explore that with clients, and I'll say a bit more about that when I get to our methodology as well. So I come back to that, Libby, so thanks very much for that. Craig.
Right, Simon, thanks. So mine's less of a question, although I'd be interested to hear your further comments on it, more of a reflection. And a few things that you said, but even kind of going back to when you were talking about the Messiah leadership, and it kind of made me think about one of the challenges of coaching, kind of almost to to not become too righteous with our with our coaching role, and the challenges around that. Obviously we're all in a position where we're trying to learn, we're learning skills, we're trying to read lots of things and become more aware of certain things that might be challenging for people, and to try and kind of make sure that doesn't kind of levitate us to this place where we feel that we're above the client and that we're trying to change the person. So I'd just be interested to hear your further comments on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, that links a bit to the earlier stuff I was saying around some of the dangers of thinking that we're transformational coaches and we can, it's kind of a sexy thing to be transformational and we're the experts who can change people. And it's sort of standing back from that and getting a perspective on it. And whilst acknowledging our agency, in coaches have agency, they impact on leaders, they impact on people's lives. There is agency there, it's sort of responsible agency, and what we're going to do with that, it's asking yourself the questions. I think, rather than having some grandiose idea that I'm a coach and I know all these psychological tricks which can take you to different places. I can press this button from my coaching toolbox or that one. That's a kind of a work I'm skeptical of. It's about kind of situating yourself in a kind of a more mutualistic way with your client. And I mean, I just love learning from my clients. It's sort of a rich experience. It's kind of part of the work. So yeah, thanks for that. Imelda.
Thank you, Simon. First of all, I just absolutely love what you're talking about this morning. And I think it's, as human beings, we all resonate with everything, with your story in different ways. So I've got two questions, or it's my interpretation and then your response to that. As a Catholic, the term coaching confessional hits me in two different ways. So one way, I think it's a bit of a judgment, and if somebody gives me permission, am I going to be forgiven or not? If I tell my story, am I going to be forgiven? So that was an interesting how that resonated with me when you use that term. And also the sense of there's always the gaps and the lacks. I was really fascinated by that and how much people bring to a situation. But it goes back to how you told your story. And as you were telling your story, I started to almost create assumptions around your gaps. And I'd just like you to, I'd be really interested in your thinking around how we assume around people's gaps in coaching. If that makes sense?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first bit of coaching confessional, I mean, I've written a chapter on it, and it's go away and read it if you're interested, because it's Foucault said that the Western society is a confessional society, and I think he's right. From Oprah Winfrey to talk shows to biographers, people like telling their stories. There's some sort of need, some desire to confess what's in us, and it's not the same in the Catholic sense of you confess your sins, but you do confess the sins in a sense. So if you're in a corporate world, you don't show weakness, you don't show vulnerability. You want to get your next promotion, you want to kind of look good, you want to be a high performance candidate, you want to be ticking your KPIs, So when you come to the coaching confessional, the sin is to confess that actually I don't know what I'm doing, actually, and I get kind of, my marriage is broken, I'm very unhappy, I'm on antidepressives, I'm really confused. You get a variety of people just saying, when they realize you're in a safe space, somehow just this confessional that comes out. It's like, it surprised me when it started to happen. Maybe it's partly my coaching style, which is about holding a space, about lots of silences in my work. Maybe it invites it. But and I think people do seek forgiveness in a sense of just the relief of saying something which you're holding on to and you're oppressing, and saying it into a space and not being judged. And having, as a coach, one of the most important things we do is just being a witness to someone's experience. To purely be a witness is actually kind of a modern way of kind of forgiveness in a sense that you're accepting somebody as they are. You know, you might not accept their behavior or something, but you know, you might challenge behavior, but you're accepting that person as a whole person. And I think that kind of process does go on in a kind of modern way. So yeah, I've forgotten the second part.
Oh, don't worry, that's great. Thank you,
Okay.
Simon. Thank you.
So Kirk.
Thanks, Simon. I enjoyed that very much. Two things. I was very intrigued and curious as to your journey from struggling with your O-levels learning to becoming where you arrived in your formation process with the Tavistock, actually training people in learning. How your mind has shifted, you know, and you mentioned your story with the family therapy and the youth work and the asylum. I could resonate with your asylum work because I work with autism, people coming out of institutions, and I also could resonate with the monk training because I've trained as a priest for many years when I left but it's very kind of specific trainings. But how do you see that in terms of the future, in terms of institutions? That's my question, you know, because for me, that's the challenge, coming back to work with the Catholic Church and being on the fringe. I see myself on the edge, but also want to bring life coaching to people on the margins for the LGBT community and places like that. But it's a struggle because I feel like there's lack of acceptance of life coaching for a start.
Thanks, Kirk. Just a quick point. I mean, I was working with the Catholic Church. I am working with the Catholic Church. I was in Rome, invited to Rome. I mean, Pope Francis is very interesting talking about synodal leadership and synodal church, which is they brought me in because it aligns to my ideas on eco-leadership. It's about voices from the margins. It's about women's voices. It's about the laity, getting them involved. So there is a space opening up, and I work with kind of 50 or 60 people, Catholics, who are spiritual directors, coaches, and we were having that very discussion. So just to say that it is happening on the margins, and yeah, but there's a lot of work to do for sure. Hattie.
Hey Simon, thank you so much for this morning. It's been amazing. A really straightforward and simple question from me. Doesn't sound quite as clever as everyone else's, but I just wondered what the greatest piece of advice that you've received in your coaching career has been.
Wow.
Sorry if that puts you on the spot.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's been so much. It's been such a long journey.
Okay.
I've had so many. I mean, huge things happen. Like, what I didn't mention is that there's been occasions when I've made assumptions about myself, and I was stupid, Simon. I couldn't do O-levels. I couldn't do school. I kind of assumed that was the truth. And it's kind of the guy from the rugby said, become a nurse, professor at university who said, like, no, you can do this, Simon. You can kind of work in this field. You're very bright. Someone said, like, I mean, to write a book, that was not on my horizon, but someone's saying to me, like, actually, Simon. So people kind of, it's not direct coaching, but it's that kind of influence. Someone saying, like, actually, they've noticed something in me which I haven't noticed in myself, and they've kind of given me confidence. So that's been a huge thing in my life. 2 or 3 people. Movement like that. So thanks for that. Giorgio.
Hello, Simon. Yes, okay. So I was quite gripped when you used the word total institution, because I'd never really heard such a all-encompassing sort of a couple of words that put into phrase a couple of experiences I've had. And I've just wondered, as a coach, we were sort of talking about this in our pod, if you've run into any problems trying to sort of infiltrate total institutions to try and sort of help the people within. Because I think when I was in school, that I may have, even though I desperately needed a coach to sort of help and things to sort of ease the kind of the process, I think I may have had resistance around it, and I may have been too blinkered, within that system of, or stuck even within a sort of a response of kind of like, everyone's against me, leave me alone type thing. I just would wonder, if you've had any issues with that?
All the time. I mean, as a coach, as a consultant, I get invited in as a subversive, really. I mean, I'm a subversive kind of character, and people invite me into their work, usually know that, and they usually kind of bring me in to kind of a challenge conformist thinking, challenge total institutions, think about leadership in different ways, think about ethical means. So because I've written books and because I get invited in on the back of the books or in back of reputation, I kind of come in on with that kind of space, and I see that as my job, really. That is really kind of the work to be done to kind of it's a bit Zen like, you know, like I'm not a Zen master or anything, but it is about people kind of when you get into a total institution or a culture, you get trapped, you don't even see it, and it's about waking people up, you know. So whether it's in the coaching world, it's to help people wake up so they can do their own formation work. So, how
would you recommend, say if I wanted to try and get into a school or something like that, you know, how to sort of get them to see, you know, the benefit?
I think everybody aspires to kind of autonomy, to liberation. My experience is if you know, I don't confront people kind of banging them on the head or some mantra about they should be like this or should be like this, but I do kind of help them see the world they live in. And if you can, you know, if you give people a choice, if you want to live in a total institution and a conformist way, once you start kind of sharing, you know, that with them, they start seeing it. And the ones who kind of aspire to change will come to you. So it's really about kind of, just kind of opening that space so people can do the work.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Okay, I'll take two more, then I'll do some, a few more, just a couple more slides I want to show you. So, Gemma.
Hi, Simon. Thank you very much for the talk and for sharing your story. I think for me, something that really hit, I suppose, physically and emotionally was the example of the 13-year-old and the anxiety for school and your sort of different approach to that. And also where you mentioned sort of thinking about what has formed someone up until sort of the point that they're at. So my question is sort of how does trauma or a trauma-informed approach come into what you do within a coaching environment?
Okay, so that's a big question for me because it's important. It's in my coach training, we do an advanced coach training, and I begin the training by talking about the wounded and the celebrated self. So there's a whole bunch of coaches come following me because they're previously therapists or trained in kind of some kind of therapy, and they often look for the wounded self. They often look for pathology. They often look for trauma. And then there's another bunch of coaches who come and they're positive psychology coaches. They've done NLP, they've done this other work, you know, and they're looking for the celebrated self, and they don't touch the wounded stuff, you know. And I talk about the need to bridge that. So it's not to be too attached to any trauma or any kind of piece of work, nor is it to avoid it. And so that trying to allow the coachee, the client, to do their work in that space, but also to notice their strengths and not to kind of label someone as a kind of a damaged person or you know, we can become too attached to our wounds. We become like and we can become too attached to kind of the idea that we can do anything and the world's kind of free from wounds. So it's about working between those two spaces, Gemma.
Okay, thank you.
Lena, just a quick one, and I'll go back to the slides.
So I just wanted to ask a question about your personal story on your formation. In the beginning, the things that you described, they were so like real. You could almost, like you said, I can remember the sound of machine, or like, so there are really very detailed memories. And I think when you start working with institutions, it was kind of very fast. You said in the beginning that you are going to leave out some details and stuff, but I was just wondering, is this emphasis on early years because it made such a big impression on formation of you, who you are as a person?
or there are so many heavy stuff in the last 20, 30 years that they could not be exposed?
I think both is true. Good observation, Ina. Both is true. Both. Like early formation did have a big impact. It does have a huge impact on how it shapes your life. And I've had some pretty big stuff happen in the last year or so. Thank you for that. Let me just share a slide again.
Hey, Simon, just so you know, you've got 10 minutes left, okay?
Yeah. Why is my slideshow not showing? Can anyone see anything?
I think you're at the end of the slideshow. It says end of slideshow, click to exit. You might need to press back.
Okay. Well spotted, Nick. So just to talk about a formation process, analytic network coaching really is my way of trying to take people through this formation process. So I work through 5 frames, and they're depth analysis, relational analysis, leadership analysis, network analysis, and strategic analysis. And that takes you through sorry, I'm going the wrong way. It takes you through this journey. So depth analysis is about the inner self, about soul coaching, about faith, about meaning, about insights, about what you're attached to. The relational analysis is about the outer self, your relationships to your family, to teams, to other people, how other people have formed you. And people often forget that in coaching. They think about your relationship to the other, but what about the other's relationship to you? How you're formed by your early life, by your teenage life, by experiences. It's a big part of the work I do. We do leadership analysis, so we move out into the world. How do you influence others, and how do others influence you? What sense do you make of power and leadership and influence in your life? Because if you want to change anything, that's an important area. Then we move further out into network analysis, about really thinking about the wider networks which you live, the ecosystems you live and you work in, and how they influence you, where change can take place, making sense of technology, people, the environment. Some people love to be in nature. We think about where they find happiness, where they find joy, where they find energy. So we explore the wider networks people live in, and then we develop some strategies to help them form themselves, and if we're in the workplace, to help them think about changes they can make in the workplace. So you can see that journey is a replication of my formation journey. It's like inner self, outer self, relational self, leadership organizations, your working place, then the wider social. So there's this journey, and this is our advanced coaching course. We take people through that journey. Just to end this slide, the meaning of coaching, I tried to capture it last night. Coaching facilitates and supports a client's formation process to help them live a good life and create a good society. Those last 2 things, the good life and a good society, are what I anchor my work in. So really thinking about, it's not just about the individual, it's about how they engage with the world. If you just think about the individual, you can produce narcissism and egoistic ways of working. To find my work, I think Nick's going to share these slides, but we explore the good life and the good society on my Edgy Ideas podcast. The Ecological Institute, we run events for this. We have our coach training. I write Substack essays about the world around us, and I'm on LinkedIn, so you can follow the work just to share that. I'm going to stop now and then just open up to any final reflections. I don't know, Nick, if you want to jump in and ask anything, because we've got 7 minutes left.
If it's okay, I'll ask one. It's not a case of hogging, it's more a case of bringing this to a conclusion in terms of the overall theme, which was formation versus transformation. And I think a lot of coaches will be on this call thinking, well, I can see how transformative coaching would be part of this without actually confronting any of your beliefs here. So I'm kind of curious on, what do you think is the shift that needs to happen in the meaning of transformation that would allow you to be comfortable with it in some way? Because I feel like a lot of transformation coaches will be like, yeah, I can work with Simon in a way that would be completely okay with. So what's that semantic thing, do you think?
I think it's a cultural thing, semantic thing. I think it's like the way transformation is used as a sexy object, a fetish, a kind of like a superior thing, like, you know, and I think it puts pressure on the coach to kind of do something special. So they kind of feel they need to be kind of cleverer, more expert, kind of change someone. So that's a change. I'm sure our work, well, I know our work overlaps a lot, you know, so I don't think there is a big departure, but it's that shift that you don't think you have to kind of transform someone as kind of this alchemistic kind of magic charismatic thing and stand back from that, so you can actually find the space to allow the person to form, and through that formation there'll be transformational moments.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's why we're doing this summit, is to start to kind of say, well, how do we talk about transformative coaching in a way that's actually sound rather than simply hyperbolic, let's say. And I think that's the risk of the word transformation. It can have it's actually why we move from transformational coaching to transformative coaching, to kind of make sure we start to think about what's the theoretical standpoint that we're coming from, rather than the aspirational change we're trying to make. One last question for you, Simon. How can people find out more? There might be people on this call thinking, that course sounds amazing, I'd love to do it. Like, how can people find out more about your actual work? Where can they go?
The EQLeadershipInstitute.org. If you click on coaching, and just to say, we got a course starting in a week online next week. It'd be the last one this year, and we've got a couple of places left. But EQLeadership.org. Find me on LinkedIn. Follow me. Like I say, I'm on Substack as well, Simon Western Substack. Just published an essay on the monarchy. We've got a big event next week on the monarchy and what that means, the meaning of the monarchy. So yeah.
I love the fact you're thinking so widely outside of coaching. I've not even heard of Substack. I'm going to have to check that out. I'm not going to open up to wider questions because I just know it's going to go way past 5 minutes, and I do need to get you guys to a break. So Simon, it just leaves for me to say thank you so much for spending your time with us, for giving us so much of your personal story. I know that, you know, there's a lot in your story you haven't told, and I really appreciate you opening up. So thank you so much. I also say, you know, whatever you do, to participants here, whatever you do, please get Simon's book, Coaching and Mentoring, A Critical Text. It really is a phenomenal book, and I think opens up a way of thinking about coaching that most coaches need to really think about. So Simon, thank you so much. Somebody's asked whether they'll get the slides. If you can just send them to me, Simon, then we'll make sure we send them out. But as for now, we're going to take a break for 15 minutes. You will know, if you go back to this site, guys, you'll then see the workshop you've chosen. You can also switch workshops, so you're not stuck to the workshop you've gone to, but once you commit, please stay in that workshop rather than flip-flopping around, because it's not really fair on the facilitator then. So choose your workshop, 11:15, join your workshop, and then we'll see you later on. Thanks so much. And Simon, thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, everybody.